Welcome back as we continue our course on critical race theory, volume three. Just wanted to get one last session in before the new year. I know that a lot of the information that we have been going over has been a lot, and we wanted to make sure we give time to process the information so that independent research can be done to independently verify our findings and claims. This week, we're going to be focusing on ways ahead and ultimately some problems and ways to explain, or when we're talking about critical race theory, we're going to learn some ways to address some of the challenges that people will bring to the theory. Because, like any theory, scrutiny is not just needed, but scrutiny is actually the way that the theory is tested and that the phenomenon is seen across different spectrums and different lenses. Because ultimately, the people who sometimes oppose a theory have another theory that is opposed to the current theory. And what needs to happen is there needs to be a reconciliation, or why is there disagreement? Now, oftentimes, that these conversations are very mature conversations, and they require people to be able to look at their own biases and their own ideas. Because if we were teaching a theory on let's say, a simulation, there are some tenets to assimilate that you have to accept. You have to accept that when you are assimilating into a culture, you might have to give up some things of your previous culture. You might have to change your name. A lot of people who came from Poland um, in America got rid of the SKI off of their name, Ski, which is a traditional Polish name, because they did not want to be associated with Poland. They wanted to be associated with America. And ultimately, by being associated with America, they have assimilated into the culture. And one of the tenets of assimilationist theory is that in order to get in, fit in, you have to change or alter or modify something of the existing culture in order to melt essentially into the current culture. And that is a tenet of assimilationist theory. Now, you can disagree with that, you can argue with that, but in order to assimilate, there has to be something that is given and received in order for you to find that there is cohesiveness. Because in order for you to assimilate, we're associating the idea that they're not being dominated. And the only exception to this rule would be warfare. Of ultimately, if you win something on the battle, you don't have to assimilate to their culture, because then you can now dominate them. Same thing with social learning theory. Social learning theory just pretty much posits that we learn how to behave socially by watching how others behave, interact socially. And that's a tenet of that theory. With critical race theory being one of the tenets, is that how we are seen in the world is through a lens of color, that we are not in a colorblind society. Now, although there are people who want to say we are, that doesn't make it so because they say it. And the idea is that if you can see from the lens that I share with you, then you'll be able to understand why some of these ideas cannot be reconciled. Now, approaches to take. When people talk about race as a lens, and this is a problem for most people, is that they can't take the current lens they have on off back and forth. Meaning, how I see the world is how I see the world. And I can't just put on some optics to say, okay, see the world this way now. And most people don't do that. They just see the world how they see the world. And as they see more of the world, it changes as they go. As they change, it changes. Well, as a researcher, I need to be able to see the world apart from how I see the world. So there has to be processes in place so you can see the world differently. And as a doctor, you don't in America become a doctor by yourself. You are only 33% of the way. You need to have two other doctors who validate what you are seeing, because it's the validation that we are seeing that allows us to build off of it. And that's what you're seeing happening in critical race theory. What you're seeing is people seeing that it is effective in one area, and they're saying, well, maybe I can look at critical race theory and look at medicine and medical outcomes. And maybe critical race theory could explain why Black mothers have an infant mortality rate that's sometimes 2 and 3 times higher and in some cases 4 or 5 times higher in southern states, the white infant mortality rate. Well, why is that? Well, let me put my critical race lens, or let's call them goggles, on to see this phenomenon. Now, once I am done seeing the phenomenon, I can take the lens of critical race off, because ultimately I can't see everything through one lens, because if I see everything through one lens, then I'm going to miss something. And that's what we conceptualize. In order to see as much as possible, I must see it with the lens and then take the lens off. And in America, what has become the problem with theory is that the theories and the lenses become fixated into our minds, where we don't know how to take my current lens off. Whereas if I'm a Christian, I can only see the world through my Christian lens. I can't see the world as a Muslim or a Hindi or a Krishna or any other lens than how I see it. And one of the things that higher education does, and one of the reasons for this course, is so you can allow yourself to take your lens off. Let's say you are a white Christian male. Okay, I don't know what it's like to be a white Christian male in America, but what do I do to get that lens? I read literature from this demographic. I talk to people. I do my own research. I look up information, because what I'm learning is that there's not two are the same. They're not two that are the same. We're all different. And in order to quantify our differences, now we have to get quantification and quantifying data of things that we are seeing. And what creates the problem sometimes is that in order to quantify our data, what we're creating is an environment where some people will see us, but not understand that I'm taking my lens off now. So I don't want to talk about race right now. I don't want to talk about the problems in America right now, or the issues that are plaguing the country because of the new election, because I don't want to use that lens right now. Today, I want to use the father lens, or I want to use that I am not in the academia realm lens. But what I've seen happening is that the people who can change and update how they see the world are the ones who tend to be more successful, because they're not ideologues. And anyone who can only see the world from one lens is by definition an ideologue, meaning they've made an idol or idolatry of one way of seeing things, because there's many ways and many vantage points to see things. And critical race theory is just one of those vantage points. It's one lens, and there's many of lenses. And as we have looked further into critical race theory, we've seen it branch out into critical Latin theory, where now we're seeing that although it's called critical race, there are certain communities who feel that critical race theory does not cover their community specifically, like the Latinx population in this country, who may feel that because of their history, their origin, that they don't have the same struggle or a different struggle. So now the Latin scholars are studying it from different perspectives, and like how it was used in medicine, and now it's being used in education. You know, one of the policies and one of the things that I look at in America from a public policy perspective is the idea of how things are viewed in America, meaning the evolution of policy. Meaning, how did we get from this policy? Well, what was the policy before it was this policy? And before it was that policy? And you can trace the history, because they write it down, but they write it down in a way to confuse people. Like, for example, when they said "No Child Left Behind," my first thought was, that sounds good. Sounds like a pretty positive thing. We don't want to leave any child behind. But what happened during the No Child Left Behind process? Many children were left behind. And not just were they left behind, they were left behind under the guise that it was not our intent to do so. And so because when we start to dissect policy in this country and we look at it through the race of lens, so now as a scholar, I do not use critical race theory as a lens primarily anymore, because it becomes contentious. And my goal in my scholarship is to overcome hurdles. So if critical race theory is a problem for some people because they can't put the lens on, then that's fine. What I tend to use is what's called punctuated equilibrium theory, which is another lens. It's just a lens to see something. And it's grown out of evolutionary biology, meaning that we evolve to a process and we get to where we're at because, once again, theory exists to explain phenomena. It exists to explain the power dynamics that we are seeing in our country. And as we see things beginning to repeat, or historical things happening all over again, what we're asking ourselves is not why it's happening, it's the evolutionary cycle of the process, meaning that we're resorting back to a process or a time frame where we didn't have information and education. And this is why the theory and why this course is so important, because in the coming years there will be an anti-intellectualism movement in this country. Now, I'm not saying that it doesn't already exist, but on a level that we have not seen, where those who are knowledgeable will become persecuted because ultimately they're not burning books so that they can get the books out of the shelves. It's the idea in the books. But what do you happen when the idea in the book has been burned, but the idea still exists in someone's mind? Well, what do? If your goal was always to get the idea out, then it was going to be to persecute the individual who holds the idea as well. And that's why so often when we are talking about education, we are learning that the ideas that we hold and that we are shared have to be shared, because so often people want to paint the idea in a way that it was not created. And that is what's happening with critical race theory. It is being painted in a way that its creators had not intended, because they know that most people do not understand theory or how it works or what it is used to explain. And so when you have to counter the narrative, it was something that Dr. Bell talked about, is counter narrative and storytelling. And so this next portion of the course, we're going to do a counter narrative and a storytelling idea. So I have this segment, or what I call it, it's like think like a racist. And when you think like a racist, it's hard sometimes, because in order to think like a racist, you must read what the racist wrote about Black people before they ever intended for us to learn how to read. Now, let me say that one more time. If you read what was written about Black people before we knew how to read, then you can understand their intention, because they were not trying to conceal anything. They were not trying to hide anything, because they felt there was no need to hide. They could openly speak and write what they were going to say or felt about us, because in doing so, it was to warn or to admonish others of the concerns that they had. So it's like, hey, we don't have to speak in code around these folks because they don't know our code. And if I want power, which critical theory is how to keep power, then I must speak in coded language. Our language is coded. The English language is one of the most coded and deceptive languages ever created by mankind, because it is an amalgamation of Latin, English, German, all mixed together to create whatever the holder or the wielder wants to make with it. And so when we talk about our culture, to not talk about our language that we use is so problematic to understand and challenge power structures. And one of those words could be simply something as lynching. When someone says lynching, well, and we say, where does the term lynching come from? Is it Captain Lynch? Is it from the Willie Lynch story? We don't know. There are stories. And so what I like to do in an anti-intellectual movement will try to challenge information that it cannot validate. And once again, using Alder's razor, if we cannot experiment or observe the data, arguing about it is silly. I don't think that it is necessary to rehash historical facts to people who don't know the historical facts, if they exist, if they can be validated third party. That is not a concern of somebody who is trying to learn. Someone who's trying to learn wants to hear the information for their own evaluation, not stop someone from saying what they want to say. Because if you get to a point where somebody feels they don't have to support their argument for whatever reason, that does not entail observation or experiment, then they don't have any truth. Let's just be honest. And the truth they have is subjective truth. It's their truth and they can keep it. But when we're talking about theory, we have to make sure we have the foundation of it. And the foundation of theory comes from experimentation and observation. So, for example, I would say that in order to understand the Black experience in this country, you can't do it with observation. You have to live it. You have to know what it is like. You have to feel it. You have to walk in the skin of someone in this country who was never designed to be equal. And for some people, they can't do that. They can't see a worldview where they can see a world where they were not supposed to be equal, because they were believe the creed that all men are created equal. We just had a hiccup for a couple of years, but we got that straightened out. But that's the fallacy of fairness, this idea of generalization, because ultimately power seeks consolidation. Power does not like to share. And so, getting back to the language, one of the reasons that language has been problematic for us is because in order to see a worldview, you first need the idea, as we talked about in chapter 1 or in our first lesson. The word idea, once again, means to see. Prior to having an idea about something, I can't see it. Now, who is the person that is showing me what I am seeing, and do I trust what they are seeing or showing to me? Because if I don't have any way to experiment with it or observe it myself, then I must take what they are saying on faith. I must take what they are saying however I take it. But if I take it to be truthful and I cannot validate it, then all I am doing is perpetuating what could or could not be true. So starting with the evidence from policy in this country, in 1871, there was a case in Kentucky, Bly versus the U.S., where 2 white men hacked to death some Black people, and they were acquitted ultimately by the U.S. Supreme Court under the grounds of a Kentucky law that a Black man could not testify in court against a white man. Now, that was the law. If you were Black, you could not testify against a white person in court. Now, this wasn't before slavery, because slavery, quote unquote, ended in 1865. But we all know it really just transformed to the prison industrial complex. But that's a separate issue. But so if it ended in 1865, then in 1871, why was there a need to say that a Black person couldn't testify against a white person in court? Well, why was that law still on the books? What about equality, 14th Amendment, equal protection? So the Supreme Court, once again, ruled that that law was valid. Now, did that law help with the Jim Crow jurisprudence? Yes. But what it ultimately told white people in America is, if I abuse a Black person, if I steal from them, if I kill them, anything I do of harm to them, they cannot go into court and say I did anything against them. So it was open season. It was open season on rape, on murder, on property theft, and it happened in the North and in the South. I know that there's a tendency to think that there was only racial abuse in this country in the South, but I would argue that you had just as much racial abuse in the northern states, because it was definitely more insidious. Because in the southern states, they could come out openly and tell you, I hate you, N-word. Up north, they would say the same thing, but you wouldn't pretty much be any area of proximity to them, because the northerner had by luxury the ability to keep himself away from the Black person in this country. In the year 1900, 90% of all Black people lived in the southern state. So most northerners, all they knew of Black people is what they heard the southerners say. And one of the reasons that many northerners did not want Black people to be freed is because they had been told that they were beasts, and that they were essentially come up here and ravage you if you freed them. If you look at what the governor of New York, Horatio, look at what he said about Black people in 1863 during the U.S. Civil War. Now the Union, you would ask, why is a governor for the Union saying that essentially that Black people are not ready to be freed? And that kind of came in contrast with the whole emancipation thing. So we always think that everybody in the North wanted black people to be free. That Emancipation Proclamation, even Lincoln's own cabinet did not want him to say that. So it was not a popular speech by any stretch of the word. They thought it was going to cause more problems. But we can go and trace the history of that. This idea that somebody can free you is interesting, because this is not how it is taught historically. Historically, he who must free who will be free must first strike the blow. And so when you say who freed the colonists from Great Britain, they freed themselves. The king didn't grant them a letter of reprisal. They freed themselves. And so the issue, and this is where we go into James Baldwin and the idea that black people have to free themselves in America. First from psychology, because critical race theory exists to explain something. What it explains is larger than we can. What it explains needs to grow, because there are problems that we are still identifying as a result of being enslaved in this country, of the intergenerational trauma, the epigenetic trauma. Now, if you don't know what epigenetics is, that means that trauma alters your DNA. It changes how you are in the lineage you put onto your kids. And then you add intergenerationalism to that. You have to unpack this. Now, who is going to be doing the research on this? And my understanding is that people who abuse you tend not to do the research or how to heal you, just in my experience. They tend to not want you to know you are abused. And so we see the rise of the Deacons of Defense, the Black Panther Party, the Nation of Islam, the Black Panther movement, the Black Power movement. We see movements that had logical conclusions when you push people into a predicament where you give them no recourse. One of the problems they ran into the 1960s, I think it was Senator Moynihan had to report, this also is part of the Kerner Commission. It talked about one of the problems when they were studying the uprising in the 60s with black people. They said one of the problems that we're running into in this country is we keep promising black people stuff and we're not giving it to them, and that's making them upset. So we should just stop promising them things, and then they won't have anything to get upset about. This policy was called benign neglect. And benign neglect became the official policy from the end of the 1960s to current day. Don't promise them anything, and they have nothing to be mad about. So that's why when you see people come out with these black agendas or the program or process for black people, we have to be weary of this, because it goes against U.S. policy. And U.S. policy is what I study. I'm a policy person. Critical race theory is only a piece of a lens to the larger policy, because punctuated equilibrium, when you put those together, when you put critical race and punctuated equilibrium together, then it's combustible. Because as people are losing explanations about why there is a difference in outcomes, we just saw what happened in New York, where the prison guards beat the man to death. And as we look and we say, wait a minute, why are we seeing white people get beat to death by law enforcement in this country? If somebody's got these videos, send them to me. I don't think I've seen too many of those where the police are beating to death a person who's handcuffed. Because it goes to a larger point of humanity, something that I think this country wrestles with. It wrestles with this idea of the new iteration, different explanation of the same phenomenon. Because some people were saying, well, Black Lives Matter, and then they were saying all lives matter, and then Blue Lives Matter. And then it was like, wait a minute, what are we talking about? We're beyond slogans. And what matters is things aren't changing. What matters is we're getting old wine in new wineskins, and we're not being able to explain why. And, as a cautionary tale, I do believe this younger generation will be looking for explanations that the older generation will not be able to provide to them. They're going to be looking for information from them, but they don't have good answers. And one of those answers is coming up January 6th. We talked about, an explanation for it. I think history will look from right now. I'll put on my critical race theory lens just temporarily to show you what I see from this. I see what happened on January 6, 2021 as being the opening salvo for the next or the second American Revolution. I see those events, and especially once they get pardoned, I see it as the thing that's going to really tear the Union apart, because it's ignorance. And I think that violence in this country has been so pervasive that when people say that violence isn't the answer to anything, I think they haven't read a book. I think that sounds ignorant to me. And I think that we've understood this concept of a privilege versus a right. And some have rights here and some people have privileges here. When you look in this country, some of the first black codes in this country in the 1860s outlawed black people owning guns. It was a big scare in Wilmington, North Carolina, the summer, the winter. Christmas 1865 was the scariest Christmas in the country, because there was a fear among white residents that there was rumors that there was going to be an uprising of black people in the country. And now, of course, this never materialized, and many black people were killed as a result of these fears. And that's why when I talked about the case Bly versus Kentucky, one of the things that I've noticed is that there was a movie called Minority Report with Tom Cruise. And in the movie, the goal was to prevent crime before it started. Essentially they had these entities who could see the future. And if somebody was going to be murdered, they would indicate it to the special force. And I submit that that's similar to what happened in America with black people. When you look at the cases and the policy, when you look at Terry v. Ohio, that fundamentally altered the relationship between the state and the citizen, where it said that the Fourth Amendment provision of the Constitution did not apply to black people. That's essentially what it said, that you do not have the right as a black person in this country to be securing your persons and your property, that without that if you look suspicious, we can't search you unreasonably. Now, we don't talk about that, but that's what it did, because Terry v. Ohio would have never passed if it was a white man. We know that because it never had passed, because they did not see them as a threat. And I often tell people, when it comes to policy in this country, race has been so negatively used. Prior to the year 1930, crime statistics in America were itemized by European nationality. So there was no category of white, black, Hispanic, etc. It was categorized by where you came from in Europe. So, for example, you came from German, then the crime statistics would say non-immigrant German or Irish or whatever. However, the country decided that this was a bad policy because it was creating division amongst the country. And on the cusp of World War II, they were trying to nationalize America, and in that national and ultimately reconcile from after the Civil War. And what better way to do that than to create a group that you can call European or just white, that you can contrast or juxtapose against the black category, and then use that to say, look at how much more criminal these people are. Now, crime statistics in this country are very problematic for two reasons. Is because crime statistics are only measuring crimes that actually were captured, not that happened. And when we start to look at these demographics of how over-policing affects minority communities or primarily black communities, what we see happening is it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And despite the policy piece of this, the lens of critical race is so important, because in seeing it in concert with other lenses, we can now make better assumptions. And this assumption, first and foremost, would be, that sexism was more a part of this last election than it was race. That's with my critical race lens goggles on. I can say sexism, going back to Kimberly Crenshaw, intersectionality. So when we intersect racism and sexism, then we have a very potent combination. And I think that was exploited, because initially I just had my critical race lens on. But then when I put the feminist lens on, and when I say lens, for some people who maybe not understand that, as an English major, when you're reading, if I'm reading a work from a Russian author, then I have to understand that there's a Russian culture he's writing about. And although I can be reading it from my English understanding, I might miss some nuances because I don't have a Russian lens. No difference if I was reading something that was in French. I don't have a French lens of seeing the world. Now, I have a good understanding of the French from a culture. I understand that the French is like the birthplace of European Revolution. When France gets a cold, France gets a chill, Europe gets a cold, and they start to cough. But I understand that left and right politics started in France, that, leaning extremism. I understand the French Revolution. Napoleon, one of my, I would say one of the people I've studied the most. But that doesn't mean I can have a contemporary French lens, meaning that the French see the world differently. They're more libertarian than we are. They have an older culture than we do. But it was ultimately the French who allowed there to be in America, because if it were not for Rochambeau and Lafayette, we would probably not have an America. One of the reasons there was a French Revolution is because they were in debt for helping us, and they couldn't feed their own people. So we are indebted to the French. But once again, I don't have a French lens. But as I talk to French people and I hear French stories, then I can tell you that my lens gets clearer the more I get better understanding. So I may never write in the French, but I can take it and I can translate it into what I can conceptualize it from my US lens. And as a traveler, if you're someone who travels the world, then you'll see that the lens that you have can be easier cleansed when you keep moving, because you have to say, all right, I was in Japan, now I went to Portugal, now I went to Spain, and I was in Azores, or, and you see the world from different lenses. And one of the problems that I think we're running into this country is that if you took off the lens because you've been wearing it so long, you might be either near or farsighted. You might be fearful that if taking off the lens can show you something that you don't want to see. And to that, I would say, don't be a coward. That we're in an era now where we need people to want to see things that might be painful, to might understand things, because if we can see the pain, then I really do think that we'll be able to bear it when it happens. Because the longer we try to shield ourselves from a worldview, and it's not critical race theory today, there'll be a new theory tomorrow trying to explain a different phenomenon that people will have a problem with. Because what I am learning is there is no way to talk about racism, white supremacy, critical anything in America that is not going to offend racist people. They're just going to be offended. But what I'm learning to do is that to overcome their offense with accuracy, to understand their argument, and countering the narrative of their story. So first things first is, as a strategy, if somebody is trying to come against a theory, no matter what the theory is, critical race theory, educational theory, fill in blank, Einstein's theories, make sure they understand what they're saying first. And if a theory is not explaining the phenomenon, if it's not explaining something, for example, Einstein's theory of relativity explains how light operates in a vacuum. That's the explanation. That's what it's trying to explain. Is Einstein right or wrong? We don't know. Now, can we test it? Yes. After we test it, can we know? Yes. Now, that's the point. When you're testing a theory, you can't test it under the premise that the theory is right or wrong. Does it explain? Now, if Einstein's theory does not explain the phenomenon and we can empirically prove that it is wrong through observation and evidence, and see, what I'm learning is that sometimes it's who's providing the evidence that becomes the challenge. Meaning, if you look up the federal rules of procedure, in order to be considered an expert to testify into a court, it is the judge's opinion that you are an expert. The judge in the court determines if you are an expert or not. Usually this is done by asking questions. It is done by credentials. It is done by validations and whatnot. Once you are considered an expert, then you can speak on the topic beyond what is a lay person. So when the prosecution wants to object to something that is being said, as an expert, the judge may allow my opinion to stand as the record because your objection is not founded in any research and or data. It could be in your feelings or your opinion. But as an expert, your job on the defense is to counter me with another expert. So you bring in an expert to say that that expert was wrong, but it's the same criteria for entering into your expert. The judge has to go in. Now, when your expert is talking, he needs to be cross-examined. Meaning, if he says something that is crazy and he's an expert, and we can prove it with evidence that what they said was not true, now we can counter him with a new story. Now, since we're both experts, we have to now talk about biases. And biases are what creates experts for the prosecution and for the defense. Biases. When Dr. Fauci or Dr. I forget the guy's name for the George Floyd, who did neck doctor or the breathing doctor, he was probably one of the best experts I've ever seen testify in a courtroom. I learned so much about breathing from this guy. Like, he was literally, and I'll put his name on at the bottom, but I learned a lot about it because he was an expert. And when he was talking to me, my first thought wasn't he's incorrect. No, he's an expert. He is board certified. He has 30 years and he has all of those accolades, credentials. He's written textbooks. He's a teacher, blah, 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 blah. So because of all of that, I'm supposed to suspend what I currently think and know. After he's talking, if he says something that I don't understand, I don't agree with, then I can now find out other opinions who are experts. Now, what I'm learning is that in order to find a process, there is a trust process in this, which is why I'm doing the course the way I am doing it. Because if you're listening to this course, then you probably know that who I am. And I think that at a certain level of education, we begin to question the teacher more important than the lesson. And so when we dissect the teacher, it becomes a lens that we can say, well, why is there a bias there? What becomes the reason is because to be a student, it requires something, an exchange. And there's an intersection in the student-teacher relationship. And part of that exchange is the forum that it happens at. Because when this is completed, one of the outcomes is this idea that you can take what you learned from the introduction of critical race theory, and then you can apply it to other areas, and you can see that you can ask the same questions. Does this theory explain this phenomenon? Now, these last few minutes, we're going to talk about the way ahead. This is the third course. There will be 3 more courses. My goal was to have these done by January 20th, which will be the inauguration. Because once again, I think that we're going to be in a time of people wanting answers and explanations to things they don't understand. And they're going to be looking for sources of information that is going to be hard to find because there will be suppression. I think that there's going to come. I think that people are going to really want to find alternatives because they're not going to see an analysis that can take into consideration worldviews that they don't currently share, without an agenda, without some type of nefarious motive, but just in a genuine concern that if we misrepresent this theory by people who don't understand it, then they're going to say, well, my child was taught something in school that was critical race theory. It's like, no. From theory, we go to praxis. And praxis is practice or process. So in this last few weeks, we've been talking about the theory. The next step in our introduction is the praxis, meaning how do you practice it? Because sometimes what works well in theory is not good in practice. And as a public policy person, my focus is on putting something into practice. Because ultimately, as a practitioner and a scholar, some people, they just study things, but they don't practice what their education is in. It's like you have an art history degree, but you work as a teller. So if you worked at a museum or curating art history, you could be putting into practice what you are a scholar in. And as a policy scholar, I use the praxis of what can we do? What policies can we enact? Because ultimately, when it comes to policy in this country, if you don't understand critical race theory, then you won't make any policy here because it needs intersectionality, it needs interest convergence, and it ultimately cannot be pro-Black. It can't be pro-Black because if it is pro-Black, what it will create is a white lash. It will create people saying, why are they being singled out? We're all equal, etc. Diversity, equity, inclusion. And we're like, wait a minute. No. We know what will happen in this country if you can discriminate with people on the basis of their race. You won't hire Black people. We know that. And if you do, it'll be for menial entry-level jobs, and you won't give them sophistication because it will allow the racial narrative that we're not competent or capable to do higher level functions to be reinforced. We know that's what you'll do. You'll do that on day one. And it'll happen, and it's already happened. Look at the Ivy League. So you're saying, well, this is your opinion. Well, no, go right now and look at, since the Supreme Court got rid of affirmative action in college, look at how many Black people are now in Harvard Law School right now. See, it starts up there, but it trickles down here. And these are all knowing effects. Yes, that person that has that private business would probably rather not have a Black person there, but he feels like if I don't have any Black people here, then they're going to say, wait a minute, I'm racist, I'm a bigot. And it's better to have 1 or 2 Black people at my company than for them to be accused of being a bigot. Because once you're accused of being a bigot in today's world or racist, there's an issue. So you have to placate and share people with things. But I want to say to all, have a happy new year. I appreciate you all tuning into the course. I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoy sharing it with you all. Wishing nothing but the best for you and your family as we continue to go into this new year with the spirit of enlightenment, to be woke. As we know, sleep means hypnosis, and we need to be woke because we're coming upon a time right now where sleep is a liability. So once again, I encourage you and your families to enjoy the new year. Be blessed, be of good cheer. And the next course will probably be in a week. We're going to have going into the praxis piece of this. because once again, praxis is where rubber meets the road, and we can dispel a lot of these misconceptions, because some of the misconceptions are, I think, they're well intended, but they're not critically thought through.